If you are tired of being a best kept secret and you're using my authority factors to grow, then you're going to love today's session. We're going to be talking about how to move your podcast into the top charts in your industry. Hey, it's Melanie here. And I'm going to be doing a little celebrating today, but I want to unpack some of the strategy behind it, because I think that there's value in really looking at what we do. So backstory, last week when I was on vacation, I got a very exciting email where this company called Good Pods, it's one of the podcast players out there, had emailed me and said, hey, congratulations, you made it to the top 100 on our chart. So I was like, cool, that's awesome. There's like 3 million, almost 3 million podcasts now. So that's not anything to sneeze at. And then when I actually went looking and I actually got into the charts themselves, I was very, very excited, because we weren't just on the top 100. We were on the top 20 charts, and Amplify Your Success had made it to the top 20 for business overall, and the top 13 for entrepreneurship, and the top 4 for management. So I was ecstatic. And so, big applause, balloon, pretend like there's some balloons, wearing a little party hat. I was very excited. Now, this is alongside the fact that we've been consistently in the top 1.5% of podcasts worldwide. That's just all podcasts. And we know that because we track Listen Notes, which is an aggregator of all of the behavior that captures how successful a podcast is. And I'm going to unpack today how this happened, because I started getting a lot of emails and comments like, what are you doing? How's that working? Why does this even matter? Right? So some of the things I'm going to share today are in the 7-step framework that I teach on how to add another 6 figures to your business. This is a big part of the authority factors that I teach. And I'll talk about why this matters, because it may not matter to you if you have your own show or podcast. It does. I wouldn't say it's a big driver for me, but I do know there's some benefits to this. It's never been the end goal, but it has definitely been a side goal to really start hitting charts. So if you do want to delve deeper into the full framework that I teach on how to add another 6 figures to your business, you are going to want to pop down into the comments or wherever you're listening to this later. You can message me or email me and say, plan, can I get the plan? And we'll give you instructions on how to access this. This is the system I have used for the last 21 years to continually add another 6 figures, and sometimes multiple 6 figures, to my business by leveraging other people's audiences. Now, let's talk about why this matters. And it may not matter to you if you have your own podcast, and that's totally cool. But let me maybe expand possibility for a minute here, because hitting the top charts, whether it's top 1,000, top 100, any of those are great right now. If you consider the fact there are almost 3 million podcasts active, right? The most important reason is it's making your podcast and your message and your business more discoverable. So having a podcast in the beginning there were some things you could do to push the needle that would kind of bump you into visibility. With almost 3 million podcasts now and a lot of different ways to listen to podcasts, it's not always as easy to make your podcast discoverable. And obviously, whether your podcast is to get you more visibility to ideal clients, or it's to share a message, whatever your goal is, the more people that discover it, the more people that listen to it, the more you get to fulfill that goal and make that greater impact. Now, a second reason why this matters, and I talk a lot about elevating your authority, and some people are like, well, that's not really important to me. And here's why I want it to be important to you, is when you have that kind of that elevated authority, you are giving yourself a little edge in the mind or the eyes and the ears, if you will, of the potential listener who is a potential client or someone who you could be changing their life. Remember that there's a lot of information swirling about in people's lives. And when you are on charts, when you are getting those advantages, that means that people are listening, but it also tells people there's something that you've got that's magic, and it's going to make them a little more curious to come and listen. And so it gives you a little bit of that edge in attracting more listeners. A third thing that I find is that it gives your show some clout. And if you are interviewing guests, I've had some people coming into the group lately who said, I want to be able to invite more guests onto my show and get them to say yes. Look, people, like, I love guesting. It's one of the big strategies we teach with Guest Expert System. But I also teach people to be very discerning about what podcasts they guest on. So if you want to give yourself an advantage to attract some of these higher caliber experts, more well-known brand names, people who maybe have a little more of a high profile in your industry, then it helps when you have that kind of clout. And if you ever decide to monetize your show, the fourth opportunity here is it's easier to monetize your show with all the different strategies, including attracting paying sponsors. And if you ever decide to charge for guest spots, that you can get that. So that's why it matters. And there might be some other things that you might bring up. I'd love to hear it in the comments if you do. But now you might be curious, okay, so how do we measure these things? And so best of my ability, these are the 4 key things that really move the needle and will bump you up in your charts, in your stats, get you higher ratings on Listen Notes or where Chartable, wherever you track. First of all, and most importantly, is consistent visibility of your show. We have an entire marketing system for my show, and it pays off because it is consistently visible. And I have peers who, in their own right, are amazing podcasters and business experts. And they're like, your show is one of my favorite shows. And that's because we do a really great job. Well, first of all, it starts with the content, but then we keep that podcast visible. Okay, so this is all in the Authority Brand Podcast Toolkit. In case you're like, well, I want a podcast, I highly recommend, don't wing it. There's a lot of stuff to figure out. So it's a very reasonably priced toolkit. It'll serve you well to get the toolkit. So now, after visibility, and visibility obviously drives the next piece, and that is the number of listens. So I've never been one to track my downloads from a place of measuring the success of my show. I know some people do, but the number of listens you get does move the needle on where you start to rank on charts. And some of the number of listens can then be bumped up by doing 2 things. One, paying attention to your keywords. Now, this might not be easy to do at first, but what you title your podcast, what you title your show episodes, what you do with show notes, it makes a big difference. I have a very noticeable jump in listens when we went from doing an abbreviated kind of like an overview of what the episode was to having a abbreviated show notes, and where I did an outline of what was involved. There's a whole bunch of technology behind that, which I'm not going to get into here, but let's just say it makes you more discoverable when there's more of a write-up to boost some of the keyword traction and help people find you. So it really is an important piece. And when I'm coaching people on the launch of their podcast, that's a huge piece of the puzzle. All right, ratings and reviews is the 4th thing that moves the needle for getting charted and being able to boost your vibe, your like listenership up, and all the tracking behind that. And a lot of people are like, how do you get so many ratings and reviews? Well, first of all, when you have great content, people are more naturally inclined to do that. I ask people when they're listening to the show, would you mind, if you like today's show, share it, give us a rating or review. And I ask our guests when they are applying to be on the show, if you've listened to some episodes, which I recommend you do, so you know the show flow, would you, if you like the show, will you give it a rating and review? So we ask, and that does help drive it. So those are 4 factors that really tend to move the needle for charting and for, getting that Listen Notes rating or Chartable rating up a bit more. Okay, So, and by the way, I know this may surface some questions for you. You're welcome to pop them in there. I may not be able to answer all the questions, but I will answer as many as I can, or I may point you towards another podcast episode or resource or something to help fill in the gaps. Because I want, if you're going to do a show, I really want you to experience the success that's important to you. And that may be that you're getting this in countries all over the world, and you're making a bigger difference. It may mean you're monetizing it with sponsorships, or it may mean that you really are getting a client attraction system in place. So whatever that is for you. All right, here's the big shebang. This is what we do. And it's actually not all that complicated once you get the system in place, but there are some moving parts. And when I started this podcast, this is my second podcast, I was super intentional about whether or not I was going to treat this podcast differently than the last one. And what was I going to do to turn this into a success? If you don't have your own podcast, you may not know there's a lot of money and time that goes into a professional podcast. And if I'm going to do it, I want to know we're doing the best we can with it. So my podcast has its own marketing system. And if you have my Authority Brand Toolkit, Authority Brand Podcast Toolkit, then you know what that marketing system is. And we integrate the podcast in a lot of ways to make sure we're giving as much chance as possible to be visible to potential listeners. So that's obvious. I think everybody realizes that will move the needle. I know a lot of people are like, I don't have the bandwidth. Then create the system, let's get you a little help. It's really worth it. It's going to help elevate the impact of that podcast so much. But here's some things that you may not realize have a huge impact on boosting listenership and boosting the traction of your show. I am intentionally speaking in communities of people who podcast or listen to podcasts. And I found that every time I was in that authority position, the listening of the podcast episodes around that time went through the roof. Okay, so speaking is a powerful component. And one of the little tricks is if you're speaking in maybe a not podcast, not as an expert in podcasting, which, if you're not, that's not going to be your gig, but wherever you're speaking, wherever you're showing up, just make sure it's in your bio, it's in your introduction. Guesting on other people's podcasts, huge. Because guess what? I call it there's like a little bridge I build. And I've seen this happen over and over and over again, where I guest on someone else's high profile podcast. And next thing I know, they're binging my podcast and then they're reaching out to me. It's part of my guest expert system for people who are very active as podcasters or they have their own show. It's a great way to boost the fan base and the community around your own show. Third is online showcases. So this is going to look different in a lot of different ways, but some of the things that I thought I'll test this and see how it works. And it actually really made a big difference. So and again, the fuel behind this is what I call collaboration currency. So the more collaborative you can be here, the more this will emerge naturally. It won't cost you anything to do, but it'll have a huge impact. Sometimes one of my peers would write a top 20 list of their favorite podcasts and publish it. So one time I got published on a top 20 list on the podcast what is the podcast messenger? Podcast magazine. Yeah, podcast magazine. Sorry. It's been a while since I read that one. So I was like, wait, what is it called? Podcast magazine. Huge boost. I've been mentioned, I think Steve Gordon did an article a few years back and asked 15 podcasters what podcasts they're listening to. So we got one of those mentions, which was very nice. We create blog posts where we feature other podcasters sometimes, like what my favorite podcasts are at that time. And then they might share that because mine's on that list. So there's a lot of different ways to use that collaborative energy. But recently, what I found is even Facebook groups can be very instrumental. So a lot of times people have these threads. And by the way, in Amplify Your Authority Facebook group, we put this thread out from time to time. And You're not using it nearly enough. This is a huge opportunity for you. But when I'm in other Facebook communities, what I do when they have those threads, we'll drop it in and say, hey, here's an episode of whatever. Well, recently I shared my insights from speaking at a podcasting event, and the producer of the newsletter for that company said, that was a fantastic episode. I'm going to feature you to the 10,000 people on our email list, right? Big boost in listens. So this is just kind of scratching the surface. There's a lot of little things I do that put my podcast on the radar. Like on Twitter, I'm very active in communities. I speak a lot on leveraging podcasts and leveraging podcast guesting. So that always kind of gets people curious and they start deep diving and going look for it. So you have to look for ways that you can create that kind of visibility for your show. It might be that you're submitting it to contests. We did that a little bit, but I found that, what was required to be a part of those contests weren't necessarily fitting my value system. So I stopped doing that. But there are certainly great contests out there that might be a fit for you. Here's some boosters that were unexpected. And I'm going to share these because there's a little bit of a cost and a win-win, or kind of a maybe a marginal win, you might say, or there's a little bit of a cost with the win is the best way to say it. But I have found that this booster, it pays off in spades. And somehow I got on the radar of a bunch of podcast booking agencies. And I think what happened is I got on someone's list of podcasts, and then a bunch of bookers found me, and then those bookers shared with other, so it kind of like had this ripple effect. And now, because we're hitting the charts regularly, now that's another way they find you. And yeah, there's a little bit of kind of overwhelm and some annoyance to that because they're constantly pitching unaligned guests. However, the payoff is that we're asking guests when they're pitching to listen to the show. And we're winning over fans. Like I have literally had guests say, this is my new favorite podcast. I love this podcast. It's like now in my my download library. So I'm listening to it every week. We're getting podcast bookers who are listening to the show, trying to figure out who the best fit is. And they're going, oh my God, I love this podcast. I'm learning. Right. And so, that was an unexpected booster. A couple more things. The quality of your guests. If you're interviewing people for your show, the quality of those guests, there's a little bit of a fine line. And I talk about this in the guest management system. So that's one of the add-ons for the Authority Brand Toolkit. But when you are guesting on, when you have guests coming to your show, and of course you're asking them to listen first so they get the show flow down. The quality of those guests is really important because, first of all, if you don't have topics that are important to your audience and you got guests just talking about anything, it's not a good fit. If you've got great high profile guests, but they're not sharing the show, they're not really engaging in the show at all, is that really going to help? Maybe. Sometimes it's nice to sprinkle in a little bit of the celebrity factor, but I wouldn't live there. I wouldn't do that all the time. The quality of guests and the conversations you're having with those guests, really tuning into what does your audience need, that's what's going to boost. And then last little tip here is don't just drop your podcast on social once and be done with it. Look for ways to share some of your hot episodes over and over. We recur post the hot episodes on Twitter, and you would be surprised the 20th, the 40th time, how that's the one that takes off. That's the one that gets all the comments. That's the one that really boosts the audience interaction. So just know that sometimes people need to see something quite a few times, or they weren't around the first time. And it's that 30th time you dropped it somewhere that somebody picks it up and runs with it. The thing that I want to bring to the forefront here is all of this is fueled by collaboration currency. Every speaking gig I get is because somebody I know and I'm collaborating with is inviting me. Every spotlight, was curated by somebody who I collaborate with, right? Like the intentionality around collaboration, which is one of the factors in my 7-step framework, it makes a huge difference because it's a lot of work to figure out on your own, and people are being given opportunities all the time to bring others in. And if you're on their radar and they have trust and respect and they see you as the authority that you are, but maybe if they can't see you, they're not going to think of you. Well, collaboration currency is fuel for all of this. Whether you're going to apply that to a show or something else, your podcast or something else, collaboration currency is a really big part of the success strategy of a business like ours. So again, if you don't have the 7-step framework and want it, just type plan in the comments, or you can DM me or reach out in any way that you want. And we can tell you how to get access to the plan, which is a free resource, by the way. Okay, so first of all, if you want to celebrate, and if you have a favorite episode of the podcast, I'd love to hear about it. And if you got an aha here today, we share it with me, whether it's in the comments or reach out via social, whatever. I would really like to hear what's going to help you move the needle. Okay, we'll be back soon.